Good evening and welcome to tonight's In Conversation Live. My name is Henrietta Bowden-Jones and I am the Psychiatry Section President here at the Royal Society of Medicine. I am delighted to introduce our guest, Baroness Julia Neuberger DBE, tonight. Before we bring her on, I'd like to remind you that there is a Q&A function and I really want you to use it. We're going to cover all sorts of things and I will be checking regularly in order to ask your questions. Baroness Neuberger is Chair of University College Hospital NHS Foundation Trust and Chair of the Whittington Hospital NHS Trust. She was Senior Rabbi at the West London Synagogue from 2011 until March of this year and is now Rabbi Emerita. She's a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, a former CEO of the King's Fund and a founding trustee of the Schwab Charitable Trust, a charity which helps support and educate young refugees and asylum seekers, set up in memory of her parents. She chaired the review of the Liverpool Care Pathway for Dying Patients in 2013. Her latest book, Anti-Semitism, What It Is, What It Isn't, and Why It Matters, was published in May of last year. Julia, you are very welcome tonight. And talking about books, the first thing I'd like to do is to tell you how you've made a lasting impact on my life since we met 10 years ago. I remember asking you how on earth you managed to be so productive in relation to output, books, papers. And you said, well, it's really easy, Etta. All you need to do is you need to take about a month off every summer, disappear from everyone's books, list, emails, everything. And all you do is you go somewhere very quiet. And I was thinking, well, okay, that sounds easily enough achieved. And then she said, and then all you do is you sit there and you write a book. So that stayed with me forever. And I every summer when I'm in my little village in Italy reading the New Yorker for 4 hours, I get this creeping feeling that something's terribly wrong and that I should be doing something far more productive, and Julia wouldn't approve at all. So there you are. Every summer I think of you. But for the sake of our audience, and there are many hundreds of people listening tonight, I would like to say how actually we did meet. It was over gambling. We weren't in a casino, we weren't in a bookmaker's, we were hard at work over a decade ago when Julia chaired the Responsible Gambling Strategy Board, founded and chaired it, and I was one of the people who tried to help her with an enormous piece of work, which is only really now coming to some sense. Julia, please take over and tell us what you remember from those days and indeed how you think things have gone.
Well, so it's very lovely of you to say all of those things about me, but let me just say that you were an extraordinary member of that Responsible Gambling Strategy Board. And yes, we had a huge task. And what we were trying to do was to look at what responsible gambling might look like, and indeed how we would support people who were problem gamblers, of whom there are many, many thousands, possibly more than thousands, tens of thousands. We don't know the exact number. You know more about it, Etta, than I do. And we were looking at ways to think about that and how one could support people in those situations. But we also needed legislation. And I think we are coming to if you like, a view as a country that there do need to be strict controls and that we do need to think quite hard about gambling and its addiction, the addictive features of gambling, which I think you know much more about from your professional background than I do, but it was perfectly obvious and perfectly observable just how serious it was. It was a huge piece of work. I thought we were a wonderful team. I mean, I wasn't responsible for choosing the members of the board, but it was an absolutely great team. And it included people with enormous expertise, you being one of them, Etta, in treating people who were problem gamblers. And I think from that, from hearing from you and other people who were treating problem gamblers, I think we got a picture of how serious the situation was. And I think that at early days indeed, but I think that we, along with the Gambling Commission, along with a lot of very brave people in all sorts of organisations, religious organisations, community organisations, I think we gradually put the pressure onto government to say, you know, you've got to do something about this, and you've got to make sure that support is available for problem gamblers wherever in the country they may be. It was a tough time.
Thank you for those comments, Julia. I think that the position the country has taken now of having a public health approach, where the emphasis is no longer on the individual's weakness towards falling prey to toxic products, but instead it's on the responsibility society has,
Exactly.
Was very much something that was, you know, the seed was sown in those early days. But I will just like to ask you one other thing in relation to gambling before we move on. I'm very well aware, as I gave evidence yesterday, that there is a Peers for Gambling Reform, and apparently there are already 150 people signed up. What do you feel places like the House of Lords, what do you feel people who want to make a change really can do?
Well, I think the House of Lords is one institution that can make a difference, although I'm not entirely sure the government always listens to us, but that's another matter. We can come back to that. But, you know, that's one thing. I actually think if people want to make a difference, then any organisation they belong to, any civil society organisation they belong to, they should say, look, are you prepared to take this up? Are you prepared to take this up as an issue? It's not only about the public health approach, although that's absolutely right. And that was, I think we were the seed corn for that. Mm-hmm. It's not only about that. It's actually saying, what as a society do we feel is okay about gambling and what do we not? What as a society do we think are reasonable controls and what not? And I think that needs to be what I call a general society conversation. I think it's not only about the industry, it's not only about the people who look after problem gamblers, it's a much wider conversation. It's a bit like I feel about how we should talk about death and dying. It's not only the palliative care people, it's not only the people who've been the carers of people who are dying. Actually, it's a wider societal conversation and we need to have it.
Very good. I have one question from Piers who says, it seems that successive governments have encouraged and normalized gambling. Is that the case? And this will be our last question on gambling, because someone else after him called Roger says, please get to the subject. Which subject, Roger, I wonder? But anyway, we are going to tackle various issues. But do you feel governments have encouraged and normalized gambling?
I certainly think the allowing and indeed the encouragement of the super casinos was something of encouraging gambling. Governments make money out of gambling and they're always looking for cash. And if you can imagine, in a COVID era, they're pretty desperate for cash. We're going to need quite a lot of it. So I think that there has been an issue about government's tolerance and indeed promotion, but I don't think it's only about government. It's about us. You know, we have to make it clear what we think.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Julia. I'm going to move on to COVID times, and I don't think any interview that takes place nowadays with people who've been so deeply embedded in healthcare as you have cannot at least touch on the recent past and indeed what we're going through at the moment. Particularly difficult time maybe for the very young and the very old. I wonder what your thoughts are about current times.
So let's start with the very old, who, you know, have been told successively by government, health professionals, whatever, to be very careful, to shield, don't go out, etc. It's not so bad if you live with somebody else, with a family or whatever. If you live on your own and in your 80s or 90s and you're told not to go out, what are you supposed to do with your life? And I had a really sad conversation with a friend who's in her mid-90s and very fit and feisty and does all sorts of things and goes to galleries, and in normal life she would be going to the theatre and to concerts and whatever. You know, she probably has a better cultural life than any of us anyway. But she says, you know, her family keeps saying she must stay home, she mustn't do anything. She says, I'm 95. You know, how much longer have I got to live for? What's the point? And I think that we've lost sight of the fact that for many older people, yes, we don't, you know, there's all the thing, don't give your granny COVID, But at the same time, what's the point of Granny's life if Granny can't see her grandchildren or go out? And I think we need to think through what we are saying to older people about, you know, what is the point of life? And they need to say sometimes, actually, I'm not staying in. Even if you think I should, I'll take the risk. Now, the problem about that is it isn't only their risk if they get sick. It's also an issue for the NHS. We don't want the NHS to be in a situation where it can't cope. But I do think we need to think hard about that. And then for the young, I think there's a real issue. I mean, I feel for the students at the moment who are locked up in their halls of residence. And, you know, should they have actually gone back when we were pretty clear that this would happen? And I really feel for the young people, you know, the 16 to 25-year-olds, this is a time when you experiment, when you get close to lots of people, you go to big parties, you're in a huddle with your friends all the time. And we're saying you can't do that.
Yes.
Are we taking those sort of teenage, early 20s years away from them? Possibly for very good reasons, but are we taking them away from them? And what's the effect on them later on? You know, are we going to see a backlash of some kind?
Absolutely. I've got a question from Joseph, who is asking whether you've got advice for those students who were first affected by the algorithm grading problem and who are now in university stuck in halls of residences. But these are very much the people you've been referring to, I suppose.
I mean, I don't know that I have advice for them, except that I think that they should speak up and say, this is an absurd situation. But I have real fellow feeling, because I think it's incredibly tough. I think first the grading and then the universities, and stuck in halls of residence, it's not much fun. And I think some universities look as if they've been really supportive. Others, I think we have some questions over whether they've been supportive enough. And I think maybe it would have been better for most of those students to stay home if this was going to happen. Although for the foreign students, the overseas students, it's an absolute nightmare because they certainly can't go home to mum and dad.
Absolutely. So this brings me on actually to the King's Fund, because having been chief exec there for several years, 1997 to 2004, I am well aware that in recent times the King's Fund have actually started looking at COVID pressures and crisis on the country, have come up with a whole set of recommendations that some of the people listening tonight may wish to look at, trying to find a better way of training the social care workforce, looking after them with better pay, better training, trying to address the funding pressures. All of these things are in the documents that are up on the website. But if we look at your experience of the King's Fund, would you say that in those years volunteering was already something that was on the agenda for healthcare? Were people considering increasing the workforce to help the population by having people who weren't so highly trained?
I think there was already a huge number of people who were in, you know, friends of different hospitals, leagues of friends, lots of people working in different ways to support hospitals and indeed some community health services. I think that was there between 97 and 2004. I think it grew. I think the emphasis on volunteering, I chaired the Commission on the Future of Volunteering. I think the emphasis on volunteering grew in the sort of early years of the 2000s, and I think rightly so. And I think we were able to say, you know, in that immortal phrase that Fiona Reynolds, who was then Chief Executive of the National Trust, said, you know, she wanted to get volunteering into the DNA of our society.
Yes.
And the reason for that is not only to sort of, if you like, help the health service or help people who work in the health service. It's actually for all of us. It's that we should expect to volunteer when we're able to do so, but equally we should expect when we're not able to do so to receive services from volunteers. And I think that as a society we're still not terribly good at that. We're good at it in some areas. We're good at it, for instance, you know, with Meals on Wheels and various things like that. When COVID struck, there were huge numbers of people who offered to volunteer, but we couldn't use anything like volunteers who put their names forward. There are lots of people who want to help, but I love these American schemes that I think people are looking at in the UK now, that, you know, you're in hospital in the States, you've had, I don't know, a hip replacement, or maybe something a bit more serious than that. And when you're just about to be discharged, they come along and they say, well, we've assigned a volunteer to you, and the volunteer will come and see you, or will phone you or email you or whatever, and check that you're okay and get your shopping if you need it, etc., etc. And then, 6 weeks later, when the volunteer says, right, okay, you're okay, you can go now, you're fine, they ask you whether you would volunteer to do it for somebody else. It's a bit like a chain letter.
Yes.
And I really like the idea of, you receive services from a volunteer, you give those services to the next person down. And I think that that's a very good way of thinking about how we as a society can support, because we're never going to have enough professionals, social care, healthcare professionals, to do everything that we'd like to provide. But we can do it for ourselves.
Who could implement something like that? Who would be best placed as an organization to suggest that sort of pass it on kindness and helpfulness that you are referring to? In America, how has it been established?
It's been individual hospitals that have done it. It's been, some churches have led on it, some synagogues have led on it, some mosques have led on it, but it's largely individual hospitals that have led on it, and it took off. People really loved it. I think here it would be something like, the Royal Voluntary Service, who are fantastic at supporting volunteers. You could see all sorts of charities that use large numbers of volunteers anyway. You could see them banding together to support this. I mean, the National Trust has huge numbers of volunteers. A lot of those volunteers would volunteer to do something else as well as what they do in the gardens or the houses of the National Trust. My own feeling is it wouldn't be hard if we really wanted to do it.
I love the idea. Now, let me take you on to the topic of spiritual and emotional fulfillment. What does that look like for you personally? And maybe, maybe also in view of your various roles, expand on that. But is it an easy state to live within, having that fulfillment?
Absolutely not. Most of the time, like most of us, I suspect everybody who's listening tonight, I'm too busy or too cross or feeling too greedy or needing to go for a swim and get some exercise or whatever to have the period of calm that you need for that kind of spiritual fulfillment. And as I've got older, I've really found that, if you want to stop and breathe, and there's this new book called Breathe, which actually is extremely interesting about this, but breathe, and then, go outside, look at a tree. I have an absolutely minute garden. I mean, it really is pocket handkerchief size. And it is amazing to me how much time I can spend in it, doing things in it, because I think it actually is something that gives me a kind of spiritual fulfillment. I think it calms me. I think just smelling the plants and the air is really good for us. And I think one of the things we're learning, and COVID again comes up in this, that, it's very hard to do the normal things that you do in the times of COVID, but you can go outside, you can enjoy nature and actually stop. Don't look at your phone. Don't look at your iPad, just stop, look at the tree, look at the plant, get your fingers in the earth. And I think I really discovered some of that when my mother died back in 2001. And all sorts of things happened, and it was all very complicated. And she had a wonderful death. It's not that. But afterwards, I found that the thing that gave me any sense of wholeness was not only just being out in the garden, but actually getting earth up my fingernails, getting my hands into the earth. And I think there's something quite basic about that. And there's a biblical thing in the book of Jeremiah talking about the Israelites, the Jews who were in exile in Babylon, and some of them were, talking about how they wanted to go back, etc., etc. And Jeremiah says to them, build houses and live in them, plant gardens. And I think there is something about enjoying and growing and all of that. And I think some of when I was at the King's Fund, we did a lot of work with women, particularly in East London, who had really quite severe depression, and they didn't have gardens.
Yeah.
And we got them window boxes, And it was really interesting about how they kept diaries. And it was really interesting how the window boxes and growing things helped. And I do think that we underplay that to our great detriment. So if I want to calm down and get a sense of spiritual calm, I think I probably go out in the garden.
That's a beautiful answer, a long and really beautiful answer. Thank you. And thank you for sharing such personal material. We have someone called Mark, a retired GP, wanting to know, saying the government relies on advice from lots of experts. Do you have any spiritual advice for the government regarding COVID? And I think actually, maybe you've covered it, but there is something about not rushing into things maybe, and taking time to reflect, that might be quite suited to current times.
And also not rushing into things, having a very measured approach. I mean, I think it's not a spiritual piece of advice, but a piece of, if you like, small p political advice. You know, have a strategy and really make it very clear to all of us what that strategy is. I think there's something that is perhaps spiritual as well as small p political, which is trust your people, trust the people, tell them what's really going on, tell them what your thinking is, and trust them to listen. And I think the evidence from Germany and Sweden is, I think, that they've been telling the people and treating them like grown-ups. Treat us like grown-ups. And I think that that's really important. And that is it's not really spiritual advice. It is a sort of moral advice, though. Don't treat us like children, treat us like grown-ups.
I like that. I think many of us will be agreeing with you tonight, listening to these words. Can I take you on to the next topic? The chair of UCLH, Whittington, is this the biggest job you've ever done? Does it get bigger than this? And it is a serious question. How does it feel to be doing this kind of thing? There'll be, you are a leader, you are a role model for many. Many tonight are listening to you, trying to understand, how does it feel to be doing such an enormous role at the moment?
It's actually fantastic, and I want to first say I would just pay tribute to the staff at both UCLH and the Whittington. I've only been at the Whittington since the beginning of April. I've been at UCLH for getting on for 2 years. I have been so moved by what I have seen during this COVID period. I mean, it's been quite extraordinary. Very sadly, the chief exec of UCLH, Marcel Levy, is leaving in 6 months. He announced it yesterday. He's going to be the chief scientist in the Netherlands, which is where he's originally from. And it's incredibly sad because watching Marcel and the team at the beginning of the real surge in March, April was incredibly moving. Yeah. And Marcel himself was working clinically. He's a doctor. He was working clinically at the weekends. He was running the hospital. He was getting the team, giving them permission to do all sorts of things. Everything had to be moved around. It was incredibly moving to see not only the adrenaline rush that was clearly happening, but also people's absolutely 24/7 commitment. I was very privileged as part of all of this to chair a clinical ethics advisory group at the request of our intensive care doctors at UCLH, and really getting close to some of them and hearing what they were going through and things that they'd never seen in their lives before, despite having been trained as intensive, was extraordinary. So what does it feel like? It feels like the most enormous privilege. It seems like extraordinarily hard work. And a lot of what I would probably be doing in normal times, like walking around the wards, I can't do. We don't go into clinical areas. But supporting our staff is absolutely key. And I also think for those in leadership positions at the moment in the NHS, saying thank you to people. They have really worked their socks off. A lot of them haven't had proper holidays. A lot of them are probably not going to get proper holidays over half term, the way it looks. And they're expecting another surge, and in some parts of the country they've already got another surge. And I think a bit of saying thank you and recognition, it's not only clapping the NHS, good though that was, it's actually about those of us who are non-executives like me as chair, going in and saying, gosh, this is amazing, and thank you, and what can I do to help? I think what can I do to help is a really important message. So these are big jobs, but I think the other thing is, you know, we're non-exec. All we can do is support and sometimes guide the execs.
Absolutely. And in that role, before I move on from this topic, do you recall any real decision-making dilemmas that you faced as a group or individually? What was the one that comes to mind?
I mean, I certainly remember ones at the King's Fund particularly, and that's probably that's a good place to mention. So quite often, you know, there would be, so we would have, the Prince of Wales was president. He was terribly keen that we did stuff around integrated medicine. There were lots of people who didn't want to do that at all, so there were arguments about that. There were some tough decisions about how we spent money. And actually one of the ones I remember well, which actually ended up brilliantly, was a very tough discussion, real argument about whether we should, at the Millennium, invest £1 million into a programme. It's called Enhancing the Healing Environment, and many of the people who are listening probably remember that. But where basically, because the King's Fund was originally a London charity, each London trust got given, for, I think it was £35,000, and a training programme, and encouraged to use that to leverage more money to make some area of their hospital a much better place, a more beautiful place that would somehow be beneficial to patients and staff. And you know, a lot of people said, yeah, what a lot of nonsense. This is soft rubbish. Don't do that. It's complete waste of money. This is not what the money's for. How ridiculous. And actually, in the end, we did do it. And it was hugely successful. And indeed, with some of the evaluation, we demonstrated that that sort of work, apart from the fact that amazing improvements were made, some extraordinary ones, but that sort of work did enhance the experience for staff and seemed to encourage staff retention and seemed to shorten patient stay. So there were, you know, there was hard data there, but you could see some of the scientists saying, this is soft rubbish. And that was that one where, yeah, that's a tough decision where eventually, you know, I had to almost like call time and say, you know, are we going to do this or aren't we?
Yeah, sometimes you just have to.
We went for it.
Yes. Excellent. And now Christopher May asks, how do we continue the ethos of giving professionals in the NHS the freedom to innovate and continue to move things forward, permission to do what we were trained for?
Gosh, well, actually, I think that I hope and think that within both the UCLH and the Whittington, we do encourage people to do that. You can't just go off and do whatever it is you fancy, it seems to me, as a clinician or anybody else, actually. But I do think that giving people permission and working in teams and thinking about new ways of doing things is really important. And I look at some of the, you know, the COVID work where, you know, it was all very experimental in the early days because nobody really knew. And we had a lot of, you know, chest physicians who said, you know, let's use CPAP. And we did use a lot of CPAP. And yes, that was very successful, but it was clinicians being trained to do what they do who, if you like, took the lead. I would hope that we're brave enough to say, of course, innovate, but I also hope that we're cautious enough and modest enough to say, but don't just innovate on your own. Do it with a group of people, discuss it. And I'm a huge fan of team working, and not only doctors in teams, but actually clinical teams, which include lots of other people. And I think I've probably seen that work best in surgery, where you have a very varied multidisciplinary team, but it's very interesting when you see a team that really works well. You almost can't tell one person from another. Yes. It's so strong. The bonds become so strong. And I do think that's a great way of working.
Yes, and actually this kind of question is so pertinent to the last months, when we've seen 10 years of research occur in a few months. Now, Julia, I'm going to do something quite unusual here, but the questions coming in, there are many people wanting me to touch on the topic of anti-Semitism sooner than I was necessarily going to. I had some sort of plan to this conversation, but I think we need to follow what our viewers would like. So I will jump several stages ahead, and really and pick up on things at a later date if we have time. But of course, last year you published the book Anti-Semitism: What It Is, What It Isn't, and Why It Matters. And in the book, which I had the pleasure of reading, pleasure is probably the wrong word, to be honest, but I was privileged to read. And there are sentences that make you stop and think. Things like, most of my mother's family had been murdered. When it comes to asking you why you decided to write it, and you've written things like that, obviously that is so clear to me. But I'd like you to share maybe what led you to feel the need to write it. And I will just mention that you so beautifully talk about your early life, when you felt that actually people were sensitive, accepting and tolerant of different faiths, and being Jewish did not feel like a sort of hindrance of any sort at the time, and that it was really only later that you started to experience these thoughts and questionings. And I will go on to talk about the Runnymede Trust report, etc. But maybe let's talk about what drove you to writing it, and maybe some of your experiences.
Okay, well, so let me start by saying what you've actually said to some extent, that in my childhood, I just did not experience any anti-Semitism at all. I grew up in a Jewish family. We were quite public about being Jewish, you know, went to synagogue most Saturdays, celebrated Jewish festivals. Nobody turned a hair. I went to school where there were quite a lot of other Jews, but you know, nobody turned a hair. There were enough Jews in my school. I think I said this in the book, that on the very main Jewish festivals, on Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement, the school did not, the classes didn't have any new material because too many of us were off for the festival. So you can see that it was quite in it, but nobody turned a hair. That was just the way it was. And I mean, even though there were kind of odd anti-Semitic remarks, I wouldn't say that, you know, nobody ever said anything, you know, mildly anti-Semitic to me at all in my sort of late teens and 20s, university and afterwards. There was nothing, absolutely nothing like what burst onto the scene in this country from 2016. And it really does go back to, I think, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. I mean, it's shocking to say so. I grew up in the Labour Party. My parents are passionate Labour members. I was a member of the Labour Party. And then eventually I became a Liberal Democrat, and now I'm nothing. But anyway, but it was just so shocking. It wasn't that there hadn't been anti-Semitism before. You've mentioned the Runnymede Trust. We'd looked at, there were anti-Semitic things. There was plenty of stuff coming from the far right. But in the middle range of society, you just didn't get it. And, yeah. And that changed. And I suppose what made me write the book was not what I was experiencing personally, because actually the people who got the worst of it were students. Jewish students had a really rotten time. And some Jewish public figures who didn't have Rabbi before their name, which made it a bit obvious. I was just so angry. I was so angry. I'm a passionate Brit. I love this country. And the idea that this was coming up and becoming, if you like, almost accepted in some sense, that really, really shocked me and made me very angry. And that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted to say to people, listen, you can be as critical as you like of the state of Israel, but it has to do with your tone of voice. And it also has to do with whether you're critical of other countries as well. And I think it's really important that, you know, that we are clear there are some things that are not okay. It's not okay to say that, you know, Jews don't have a sense of irony. It's not okay to not turn a hair at a mural in East London that it could have come out of Der Stürmer in the mid-1930s with, you know, Jews with hooked noses over a Monopoly board oppressing the poor. It's not okay. And I think that you have to, sometimes you just have to get up and say, this is unacceptable.
Julia, can I ask you whether the 2017 report, Community Security Trust and Institute for Jewish Policy Research, showing that essentially 30% of the population was holding some anti-Semitic views. 5% were more hardcore, and others, 25%, had a sort of negative attitude towards Jews. I mean, I was very shocked when I read that, and I'm understanding that therefore your perception of the last 15 years having worsened the polarization is represented in a document like that quite clearly. What would you say to that?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that the Jewish Policy Research and the Community Security Trust have very carefully, you know, monitored what's been going on, and they have shown that it's grown. Now, when you talk about that, so what they say is it's between 2 and 5% of the population that hold seriously anti-Semitic views, and other people may hold 1 or 2 anti-Semitic views. Now, they'll have had things said to them, and, you know, do you agree, you know, Jews are too rich, whatever, all of those things. They control the media. Some of those are really awful old canards, but I think that one has to draw a distinction between people who do hold 1 or 2 views and who, if it's pointed out to them, very often say, oh my God, that's really shocking, and people for whom it's hardcore. And the worrying thing is that the hardcore itself is growing, as well as the general acceptability, which suggests that the two are connected, and not just in the UK. This is a Europe-wide issue. We've seen it particularly in Germany with the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. We've seen it even in Italy, your beloved Italy. There's been a rise.
Oh, very much. Yeah.
And it's everywhere. And what's interesting is it's from the far right and it's from the far left. And so, and somehow they sort of meet in the middle. I mean, they wouldn't like us to say so, but it's true. And so, yes, it's really worrying. I think there's something quite interesting about what's happening in Labour now. I mean, it was that in Labour that really got me going. I think Keir Starmer has been extraordinary in trying to stamp it out and saying it's not acceptable. And I think this is about leadership. I think people have to say, this is not acceptable. If this is how you speak, actually, we don't want to be with you. We don't want to talk to you. We don't want you in our group. This is just not okay. And it's equally true. It's not just about anti-Semitism, because, you know, we've monitored it for anti-Semitism, but it would be equally true for Islamophobia. It's absolutely shocking. Yeah. And one of the things that shook me, I don't live that far from the Regent's Park Mosque. And one of the things that shook me just a couple of years ago was walking down Wellington Road, sort of going down past the mosque and seeing people spit at Muslims going to prayer. And I just thought, this is completely, utterly shocking. And and the xenophobia, you know, if you unleash xenophobia, it's quite good at growing. So I think there has to be a leadership thing about putting it back in its box and saying, you know, not acceptable. You won't get rid of it. I don't believe that you will get rid of hatreds of difference of all kinds. And that could apply to people who have mental ill health. It could apply to people with learning disabilities. It's very obvious when it's anti-Semitism or it's Islamophobia. I think you never ever get rid of it completely, and human beings quite like to be like animals, so which is the animal we don't like? But you can do a lot by leadership, and I think all credit to Keir Starmer. I think he's doing a great job.
Thank you, Julia. I love hearing you speak like this. And let me just read what Anne Casement says to me. Dear Etta, please keep your questions short so Julia has more time to speak.
It's a conversation.
Okay, Anne, I will try and do that.
No, we need a conversation.
I love it. Anyway, there's a question. There's a statement from Olga Farag here saying, is ideas of supporting BAME groups, is it working properly at NHS and throughout the UK? Are we doing enough really within the NHS structures? Of course, we've got all sorts of groups set up. I'm just thinking of the Royal College of Psychiatrists now, but this is pretty much now throughout at medical level. But what do you think is happening through the NHS?
I think it's got better, but it's nowhere near best. I think that's, again, I think I'm talking a lot about leadership. It's a leadership question. We need to say, this is how we need it to be. I think some of the workforce race equality stuff that's going on is fantastic. We're doing a lot, particularly a lot on that actually at the Whittington Hospital. And I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud that a lot of our Black and minority staff are getting a chance to do various kinds of training to, give them new and increased leadership skills. And I think we need to do a huge amount of it, because you just have to look at the figures of the numbers of people from minority communities who are non-executives or very senior chief executives or on the boards. It's better than it was, but it's nowhere near good enough. And it seems to me that, we've got better, still not best about women, but we've got better about women. We've got a long way to go on the BAME question.
Thank you. We will come back, I think, to this topic before the session is out. But you mentioned women just now. Julia, how do you feel being a woman has impacted on your career, positively, negatively, or if at all?
I think it's impacted positively quite a lot of the time. I mean, one of my more curious appointments at one stage was that I was Chancellor, so titular head, if you like, of the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland. So I was neither Catholic nor Protestant. It was overwhelmingly male as an institution, so they thought they ought to have a woman. So I kind of ticked a lot of the boxes. I mean, that's one of the examples where I think probably being female was helpful. And that was, of course, when we also got groups of women meeting from the north and the south in Ireland. This is very, very early days of the peace process and getting the women's movement getting involved in that. And I think being a woman leading some of that from the point of view of my university was very helpful. So sometimes it's been very helpful. Sometimes I think people have sort of looked at me, and particularly as I've got older, and thought, gosh, that old bat, which is the sort of thing that, people say about women rather than about men. I think it's a mixture. The trouble is, of course, I don't know what it would feel like to be male. So I can't really compare. All I can say is that I don't think I've had much of the, I'm not taking you seriously because you're a woman. And I do wonder, and this is sort of just throwing it in, but I went to an all-girls school and I was also an only child. And I do wonder if those have something to do with it. So that, if you like, as a child, I made the assumption that, I could do whatever I wanted. And I wonder whether if I'd been at a mixed school or whether I'd had brothers, it would have felt different, but I didn't. And my parents always said, you can do absolutely anything you want to. And neither of them had been able to do everything that they wanted to do. So I think they were very keen on me being able to do that. So whether that's female or just family, it's hard to tell.
Yes, thank you for that. Staying on topic a bit in relation to what we were discussing earlier, I'm thinking of refugees and the great work you've done in this area, setting up the charity. Britain took in 10,000 kinder transport children before the Second World War. Your mother came across in 1937 when she was only 22. How do you feel now in relation to a government's or a country's approach? Do you feel we've got a duty of care and a continuation of the history, that something we did so well in those years? Or do you feel we are dealing with different circumstances and therefore we are justified in approaching things differently? So over to you.
Okay, so this is very topical because we have been debating and indeed voting on the immigration bit of the Brexit bill, so the Brexit immigration stuff this week in the House of Lords. In fact, we voted till nearly midnight on Monday. And one of the things we voted on was about children, and Alf Dubs, the amazing Alf Dubs, who himself came on a kinder transport, has pressed the government and pressed the government and pressed the government to be willing to allow children to reunite with families, to be willing to take those children whom local authorities can look after, and local authorities have said that they can. And we've defeated the government time and again in the House of Lords, people of all parties. I think you people need to understand there's quite a broad alliance on this. Will the government listen? I fear horribly not. Do I think it's the same as it was in the 30s? No, it's different. But do I think people are fleeing the most terrible things? Yes, I do. I think people fleeing from Syria, yes, some of that is very much the same. I think it's been terrifying. If you're fleeing from famine and, you know, absolute desperation and destitution, yes, they're not out to murder you, but you'll die nevertheless. I think as a country, as a wealthy country, I think we have a duty of care. We can't take everybody. Nobody is suggesting we can take everybody, but that we can take quite a few, and we should treat those we do take well, and we shouldn't keep them hanging on for a decision as to whether they're going to get settled status, refugee status, leave to remain, whatever it happens to be. We should do these things quickly and decently and behave like a decent society. That's not to say, by the way, that everything that Britain did in the 1930s was great, because it wasn't. But if Britain hadn't behaved as well as it did, because it took we don't know exactly, but between 70 and 90,000 refugees came from Nazi Germany and Austria between 1933 and 1939, and the Kindertransport children. So they were pretty good, not good enough. They could have done more. But should we look at that and think what we could do now? Absolutely, we should.
Julia, what you set up the Shrubs Charitable Trust. What do you do in terms of these young refugees? What does the charity do?
Okay, so what the charity does mainly is help people who haven't yet got refugee status, because they're the ones who are really stuck. They're in limbo, and it can be for 8 or 10 years. I mean, it's a really long time. You're not allowed to work. If somebody doesn't pay your fees, you can't go to university. You get very limited money on which to live. It's pretty awful, actually. And for young people, it just takes away their future. And we've been talking about what happens to young people just who have had some of their youth taken away. Well, what would happen if you couldn't even go to university, let alone be locked up in your hole of residence? So what we do is we give full scholarships because somebody else left her entire social worker, left her entire estate to us. So we give full scholarships to maybe 5 students a year to go to university. We pay their fees and their living expenses. We won't pay international fees. We get the universities, if we can, to charge home fees. And we give small grants to quite a lot of others. I mean, really quite a lot, as many as we can. We're not a big charity, to enable them to pay part of their fees, and then other people often chip in with a bit. You get a bit here and a bit there, and eventually you've got enough to actually go to university. So that's what we do, and we encourage people to get a future. And we work with an extraordinary organisation that works with our young people on our behalf, called the Refugee Support Network, who specialise in education for young asylum seekers and refugees, and it's been extraordinary. I always think that, my mother, who came as an asylum seeker, she was 22, she came as a domestic servant, she lost her education. I always think, what would she have wanted to happen to the money that she left, which wasn't huge, but it was some. I think she'd have really wanted other people to get an education.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And of course, if people want to learn more about it, now they know the name and can look things up. Now these messages are coming in really fast. There are so many people wanting bits of you, wanting to thank you for all you are doing, wanting to thank you for your leadership, and I'm just struggling to keep an eye on them. But there was one on death and dying that I'd like to move to, because of course we are now 10 minutes from the end of the session, and one of the things that I did want to at least touch on was the end of life care. So Jane has sent a message. I want to hear more about your views on death and dying. I think you're right that the discussion needs to move into wider society and not to be confined to those for whom the idea of the good death is central to their profession, for example, palliative care or religious conviction. I would like to hear how we can broaden it out. Is there such a thing as a good death or good dying? And how do we start that conversation? I think that's a beautiful question.
Well, there are some ways of doing it, and indeed, in some parts of the country, there are things called death cafes, where people literally sit and have a cup of tea or coffee and a piece of cake and discuss attitudes to death, including what they want of their own death. And I really would like to see death cafes all over the country. I would like people to think it was completely normal to talk about what you want when the time comes for you, and how you want to be treated. And it's not only about the technical stuff of do not resuscitate. It's not only the technical stuff of, you know, is euthanasia right or wrong? I don't want to go there, because that's not what this is about. This is about saying, when the time comes, I want to die at home, or God forbid that I die at home because I don't want to do that to my family. When the time comes, if I'm in a care home, I want there to be other people around me. I don't want to die in a room on my own. I want to have my family around me, or I don't want my family around me because I don't want them to see that. When the time comes, if I'm in great pain, I want them to give me enough pain relief so that I'm completely blotto and I don't know what's going on. And I don't want them to say, well, that's not a good idea because you might become addicted. If I'm dying, what does it matter if I become addicted? And I want that kind of conversation. And I think it's really important, because what I think we do in this country is we either professionalize it, palliative care, although, you know, most of the services are not provided by palliative care. You know, district nurses, community nurses, GPs, all sorts of people are there, including palliative specialists, providing a wonderful service when it works well for people who are dying at home. So, but we need to have those discussions, and we need them not to be about euthanasia and not about palliative care. And I chaired the review of the Liverpool Care Pathway, and the problem partly was it was just about, this is the way we should do it. The trouble is, there isn't one way to do it, because people are different and people want different things, and that may be influenced by their religious conviction. It might be influenced by what they've seen of their own parents dying. It could be influenced by all sorts of things, and we need to listen. And I think in health and care services, we tend to regard ourselves as professionals, and sometimes we're not very good at listening, because the expert in how somebody wants to die is probably the person who's dying.
Do you feel, Julia, that with the enormous number of extra deaths we've experienced in the UK in recent times, this type of conversation could now be aired at a higher level with a bigger profile than maybe it has had in the most recent times, when Brexit and other things were occupying a lot of people's minds?
I absolutely think this is the time to do it. I mean, people are very aware that a lot of people have died untimely deaths. A lot of people are aware that when people were dying in hospital from COVID, you know, families couldn't go in and visit. Yeah. You know, the conversations, if they existed at all, were on FaceTime. I actually thought the staff at UCLH and the Whittington were completely amazing in how they made the technology work for people. Really, really moving to see that. But people are much more aware of what actually happens. And I think they're aware that, you know, people who were dying of COVID were surrounded by people wearing protective equipment and a big mask. They couldn't see their faces. They could only see their eyes. You couldn't really see them smile. I think this is the moment to have some of that conversation. And, you know, maybe this is the moment that death cafes, which have mostly existed, I think, within church halls and so on, maybe the death cafes should become virtual. Maybe the RSM should take this on and do something like this, and really, you know, say, okay, folks, do you want to have that debate?
So this is fantastic, Julia, and I think we will pick this up. Certainly in my role as president of psychiatry, I'd like to address this. Now, a couple of comments. Someone says to us, what a wonderful amount of common sense. Thank you both so much. And this is quite a nice way to come towards the end of the evening. Do you have anything else that we may not have asked you tonight, but that you really would like to share with the hundreds of people who are listening to you tonight, Julia?
I do, and it really is relevant, particularly, I think, to your expertise, Etta. I really would like to talk about the mental health effects of COVID and isolation. And we've talked a bit about older people and younger people, but I think we should also talk about people in the middle. And I want to talk about two particular groups of people. One is some of the professionals who've been dealing with the really acute phase of the intensivists and whatever, and the stress that they've come under and the need for support that they really have. And I'd love to, to think through how we can give them enduring support, because I don't think this will, it's not a quick fix. And the other thing is the rest of us, because I think for many of us, just not having the normal social contacts, not having if you and I had met in person, we'd probably have had a hug at the beginning, just to say, isn't it really wonderful to see each other after such a long time?
Absolutely, definitely we would have.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't do that now. And we're animals. We need it. We need that contact. And so I think I really want us to focus on what the long-term emotional and psychological effects of social distancing are going to be for all of us, and the long-term emotional and psychological effects on the people who've been the specialist people treating people with COVID, what they will be, because they've seen things they never thought they'd see in their lives. And I think I'd really love us to think that one through. I mean, we are trying to provide that support both at UCLH and the Whittington. Have we got it right? I don't think we know. It's too early, but I'd love you in your role as president to actually be doing some exploration of that, because I really think, this is going to be a big issue. I think we may come out of some of this social distancing maybe sometime in the middle of next year. Who knows? Depends on the vaccine. But even if we do, we'll be nervous. People will be nervous of crawling out of their holes.
Yes.
I think there's a huge issue about how we reinvent, if you like, the courage to come out, and how we support people whose normal way of being has been so challenged.
So I'm really interested in this, and I think you've just inspired us into a half day at the RSM, driven by the psychiatry section, but absolutely not only in terms of participants, where we take this conversation further with the various NHS trusts and all the people who are interested. So I will work on that, Julia, as a special thank you to you for tonight, and because I deeply feel like you do, that this needs addressing now, so that we may take care of people who are suffering. So on this note, I think we should thank you so much from all of us tonight, and wonderful to see you again, even though, as you say, it is virtual and there's no goodbye hug. So I will now just move on to some house business with closing remarks about the Royal Society of Medicine providing these evenings free of charge, but welcoming donations to continue with this educational drive. And to donate, all you do is you follow the link, you scan the QR code on your screen, or go to our website and click the Support Us button, or you can just join and become a member. So on that note, I shall say good night, and thank you, Julia, for being such a wonderful guest tonight. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Etta. Bye.